So let's think about how these standards might play out in a classroom. Let's start with, we're going to look at standard B, which is systems of oppression. So wordy, excuse me, wordy one, so we're going to unpack it. So culturally responsive teachers and leaders understand that there are systems in our society, especially but not limited to our school system, that create and reinforce inequities, thereby creating oppressive conditions. Lots of big words being thrown around here. Let's think about what this actually means. It really means that we have a system in place that is often unfair. It might privilege students, it might harm other students, or make academic success more challenging. And so let's think about, make sure, first of all, we're not continuing to contribute to that, but also maybe move away from it, disrupt that a little bit. So thinking about the standard, theoretically, how does the standard help explain and predict a student's outcomes in school, right? Well, if we make the system more fair, then students will be more likely to be successful. One example of this was a picture book that I was reading with my daughter one time, and it was Amira's picture day. And Amira's family is Muslim, and during Ramadan was when her school was having picture day. So there was, a lot of sadness for her, thinking she was going to miss picture day and not be a part of this really important moment and have these memories. By the end of the book, she's able to get to the school and be part of the picture. But my takeaway from it was just realizing that for the students who are Christian, this would never be the case, right? Our academic calendar is really planned around Christian holidays and activities so that students who are Christian are not missing out on anything. But for many other religions, that is the case. So thinking about the standard, how can we move away or be more thoughtful about how we are planning activities, how we are organizing our calendar, so that we're not making it unfair for students based on their religious background. Also thinking about music and other activities that are expensive. If you've ever been in music at all or other forms of arts, they cost money, right? And this limits the ability for many students who are in lower socioeconomic categories to take part. So how are schools, how are communities making it more accessible for students so that they can be part of music and other arts activities? Wi-Fi. Tons of stuff we do and expect students to do relies on a reliable Wi-Fi connection. I think this became very apparent during COVID. Not everyone has reliable access to Wi-Fi. So if we are requiring the use of that for students to be completing different projects or activities or learning something, we need to make sure that students have access to it reliably, or we need to find other ways to assess or engage students in learning. Extra credit. We often don't think about extra credit as being inequitable, but it often is. I find that most extra credit projects, activities, ways to gain more points and to move you ahead academically, oftentimes will either require transportation or time, getting to a place, maybe going to see a show or going to see something and writing a reflection on it, or requires extra resources, purchasing things, putting things together. And so we have to think about this. If I'm offering this extra credit, can everyone complete it? Or would it be harder for certain groups of children? And so we have to be thoughtful about that. One of my very favorite activities my daughter brought home that really reflected this kind of trying to push away from these systems of oppression was the science activity that she did in first grade. And the first graders had to start by drawing what they thought a scientist looks like. Okay, and so my daughter got kind of this cartoon one of looks like Einstein, right? And then the teacher came around and added a picture of them and showed that this is what an actual scientist looks like. Because if you look at certain careers and occupations, oftentimes students don't see themselves represented there. So as teachers, if we can disrupt that, if we can push away from that, if we convince students that, no, that is you. You are a scientist, or you are a writer, or you are an artist, that is very, very powerful. This one gave me goosebumps. I loved this activity. Other examples might be like, for instance, in Standard G, to ensure classroom and building decorations are inclusive of all students throughout the building or within the community or city at large. So theoretically, how could these standards explain or predict a student's success in school? And I've actually have this written out here. So if a student visually sees themselves represented in the school setting or community setting, it could make them feel a sense of belonging or that they are valued enough to be shown. Therefore, they are more likely to feel at home and less of an outsider, which could increase their motivation and ability to do well academically and support their emotional and social well-being. Okay, and so theoretically, that's why that standard matters. That's why it can make a difference. So it might be something like, hey, in March, if you're doing stuff for Women's History Month, are we showing all different types of women or just a certain type of woman? Okay, and thinking about the diversity even within a group and making sure that we are inclusive of students. I also even think about artifacts like yearbooks. Okay, we have everybody's picture in there, but then we have all these random pictures sometimes that people have taken in classrooms or at different activities. Are we being inclusive of who we are representing in those? Because sometimes I find that it's a certain population of students that gets all those candid shots in there. So that's an example. Even things that are up on the wall, right? Are we being inclusive of language or culture? If you've ever been to, if you live in the Bloomington Normal area, Cedar Ridge Elementary School, the moment you walk in, you recognize that everywhere you will see English and you will see Spanish and you will see all different skin types represented. And that is, you walk in and you know that that's how the school is from immediately opening the door. So is this culturally responsive teaching? This is actually a picture I took of my daughter. She was about to turn 4, and they were learning about eye color. Well, no, sorry. They were learning about counting, but they were doing it through thinking about students' eye color to tally it up and see and compare the number of people who had green eyes, brown eyes, and blue eyes. So they found that 2 people had green eyes, 10 people had brown eyes, and 3 people had blue eyes. And then the teacher put kind of their faces on the wall to kind of show how it led to this. Well, my daughter was the only student of color in the classroom. And so when I walked by this big display, I was like, oh, where are you, Abigail? And then I was like, oh, I see yours, because it was the only brown piece of paper. And so I sat there and I was like, okay, is this culturally responsive? Do I feel okay about this? And what I decided is that if students were, designing their faces, and she was like, I want a brown piece of paper because that is how I see myself. Beautiful. That is culturally responsive teaching. She is able to self-identify. She's able to express her identity and how she sees herself. Now, I don't think that was the case. I think what the case was is that students were given white paper and then she was given a brown piece of paper to represent her face. And unfortunately, they only had one brown piece of paper, so she couldn't have brown on brown for her eyes and her skin, so they gave her black circles to put on for her eyes, which created all confusion in our house. But that would be an example that is not culturally responsive, where you are making decisions about a child's identity or you are pushing something on them, and also not having the materials where students can really express who they are. I don't blame the teacher here. She did not have the tools or materials to really make this happen either. So we brought in some multi-ethnic paper, crayons, markers, all of those things, but we need to make this easier in classrooms, right? So that students can adequately express who they are and represent how they want to be seen. Students as co-creator is one of my favorite standards. And that's where we really involve students in the decision-making and the sharing and empowering them to be part of the classroom and curriculum. One thing can be just even persistently solicit student feedback, value that feedback, resist defensiveness, and adjust based on that feedback, right? Just how are things going? Let me know about this, this, and this. And then students can share with you, this is what's working, this isn't. This is what I'd like to see happen, or here are some ideas, and really take that without defensiveness and make changes. Even how I do a mid-semester survey in here, where it is anonymous, that is really helpful, right? And not to get defensive about what anyone says, but be like, oh, I didn't consider that. I didn't consider that maybe because of certain people's schedules, that wouldn't happen. Or for instance, I had a class where they were supposed to interview a teacher, and I assumed everybody has a connection to a teacher, right? Well, not everyone does, especially if you're from a lower socioeconomic group. You might not have one in your family or extended family. And so that type of information is important so you can shift gears to make sure that you are centering students and who they are and not making school more difficult. I had a doctoral student who did a very cool project. This is another example of culturally responsive teaching where in the class they were in charge of learning to critically read a text. But she said, do we have to think of text as only books? And instead she said, can we use gaming as a platform for that? Can we think of video games as a form of text that you can critically read? And in fact, she designed a whole unit around this. And as you can imagine, students were really into it, where you can look at issues of power, how words are used, how females are portrayed, how masculinity is portrayed. Really, really meaningful project, thinking about, okay, the culture of the students that she's teaching who are really into video games and technology, right? And tapping into that. Another example would be culturally responsive teachers educate themselves about students' communities, cultures, and histories. I will say this is a moment I'm going to share with you that I failed as a teacher on. I always had Family Friday. Every Friday we had some type of activity where adults in children's lives could pop in at some point and participate, whether it was like making a healthy snack or a writing session or some type of sharing of projects or materials. One afternoon I was in the grocery store and I ran into the father of one of my students and we were chatting and I said, "Oh, can you make it for Family Friday tomorrow?" And he's like, "No, actually tomorrow is our day of worship because the family was Muslim." And I was like, it was one of those oh no moments. Like, I have not done basic research on many of my students' religion to understand that Friday is a day of worship. Therefore, if we're hosting events, we're hosting activities, we are keeping some families from being involved and being able to show up or be engaged in that way. And so I had to change that. I had to alter it and rethink how this was, right? But that was on me. I should have done, my basic research or really gotten to know that community and that religion more so that I didn't have Family Friday. Another example would be engage with students' families and community members outside of the classroom to develop a more holistic understanding of the students' lived experiences. I make my pre-service teachers do this wherever they do their clinical experience. They have to go out in the community and take pictures of 3 places that their students have talked about, whether it be Petco, because that is a great place to learn. It's basically an indoor zoo, and think about how they could use that for instruction. A lot of them will go to the Y because kids are really involved in recreation and sports and think about what they learn there. There's a game center thinking about how can we engage more play and games in the curriculum. One student was really into loving to go to Spiceworks, which is a spice place, which is mother and kind of helping in the cooking process. And so getting to know your community, what's there, how students engage with that can make our teaching more meaningful. Another example, this is when I was teaching, it's related to make authentic connections between academic learning and students' prior knowledge, native language, culture, and values. I have a picture of a girl sneezing because it was a time of year where everyone was sick, kind of like now for us. And I was chatting with a girl and she was talking about how her mom had this really special recipe. It was a type of tea or a drink that helped her recover from this cold so that she could make it back from school. And it gave me a great idea because we were just entering into doing persuasive writing. And I was like, ooh, what if we do something like this about how to heal from a cold, right? As our question for this persuasive writing to see if they can persuade us based on their family's practices, right? And so it's an authentic connection to the children. There's not a right or wrong. I'm not making decisions on what they have to write about, but it can tap into their prior knowledge, their native language, their culture, and their values to share that. And it was so interesting all around. I cannot even tell you the things that I've learned of ways to heal from a cold.